The Pacific Northwest had its own kind of magic in the spring. The air carried a damp chill that seeped through your clothes, and the forests felt alive, not just with the songs of birds and the rustling of leaves, but with something deeper, something ancient. George Malone didn't believe in any of that mystical nonsense, though. He was from Boston, a city of bricks, beer, and boisterous sports fans. His days were usually spent maintaining enclosures and feeding exotic animals at the zoo, but this time off felt well-earned. The trip promised a guided hike through the lush forests of Washington state, a chance to disconnect from city life and recharge. The group was made up of 10 people, led by a chipper guide named Carla. She promised the hike wouldn't be too challenging and assured them it would be worth the effort for the stunning views of the forest canopy. The day began cloudy, with a dull gray sky that seemed to press down on the treetops. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. George noted how different it felt from Boston, where even the parks had a kind of organized chaos. Here, the forest seemed to stretch on forever, untamed and unconcerned with human activity. The hike started smoothly, with Carla pointing out various plants and landmarks along the trail. The group moved at a steady pace, chatting and snapping photos. George mostly kept to himself, enjoying the peace and the distant sound of water from an unseen stream. By mid-afternoon, the trail took them deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker here, their trunks towering and their roots weaving intricate patterns in the damp soil. The air felt heavier and the group's chatter began to dwindle as they focused on navigating the uneven terrain. It was then that George first noticed something, or thought he did. A shadow moved between the trees, too large to be a bird and too quiet to be another hiker. He stopped and scanned the area but saw nothing unusual. "Everything okay?" Carla asked, pausing to let him catch up. "Yeah, just thought I saw something," George replied, shaking his head. The rest of the hike continued uneventfully, though George couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He told himself it was just the unfamiliar environment playing tricks on him. The group reached a clearing as the light began to fade. Carla decided they would camp here for the night rather than risk navigating the trail in the dark. A fire was quickly built, and the group huddled around it, grateful for its warmth. As the fire crackled, George leaned back and stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. He caught himself thinking about a video he'd once seen online about hikers vanishing in national parks, but he shook the thought away. "Spooky out here, huh?" one of the others said, their voice light but their eyes betraying unease. "Just nature," Carla said firmly. "It's nothing to be afraid of." But then Bruno, the dog one of the hikers had brought along, began growling. His low, guttural sound cut through the quiet. Everyone turned toward the dog, now standing rigid, his eyes fixed on the edge of the clearing. George followed the dog's gaze and felt his stomach drop. There, just beyond the circle of firelight, something sat behind a tree. It was barely visible, more of a shadow than a shape, but its outline was unmistakable. It was large, far too large to be a person, and its hunched posture made George's skin crawl. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered. Carla shone her flashlight toward the tree, but the light seemed to scatter against the mist, revealing nothing. The shadow didn't move. It simply sat there, watching. "Everyone stay close," Carla said, her voice tight. The fire felt like their only protection against the oppressive darkness. The group huddled together, whispering nervously. George couldn't look away from the tree, half expecting the shadow to leap out at any moment. Hours passed and the figure didn't move, but when the fire began to die down, the growling started again. This time, it wasn't Bruno. It came from the woods, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to echo through the trees. "We need to leave," George said, his voice shaking. "But it's too dark," Carla began, but she was cut off by a loud snap, like a tree branch breaking under immense weight. Panic set in, and the group scrambled to gather their belongings. They had no choice but to abandon the fire and head back toward the trail. The journey through the forest was harrowing. The creature didn't attack outright, but it stalked them, its presence a constant in the shadows. George could hear its heavy breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. At one point, he thought he saw its eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, but when he looked again, there was nothing. They moved as quickly and quietly as they could, their flashlights bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps in the gloom. When they finally emerged from the forest and stumbled into a small village, they were shaken, but alive. The locals didn't seem surprised by their story. "You're lucky to be out of there," one old man said, his voice grave. "People talk about things in those woods. Big things." It wasn't until later, after George had returned to Boston, that he began to piece it all together. The creature they'd seen matched descriptions of a legend he'd heard whispers of online. Bigfoot, the elusive giant said to roam the forests of the Pacific Northwest. George didn't believe in those stories before. He did now. Bladenboro in the summer was nothing like Denver. In Denver, you could feel the mountains breathing down your neck, cool breezes rolling in even during the hottest months. Here the air clung to you, heavy with humidity, and the dense forest seemed alive with sounds that never stopped. I joined this trip with some hesitance, a group outing organized by a travel agency, promising a rustic retreat in one of North Carolina's most storied areas. The stories, I'd later remember, weren't about its beauty. We were staying in an old house on the edge of the woods, a weathered structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. It had a charm, sure, but it was the kind of charm that came with creaking floorboards and shadows that lingered just a bit too long. Our guide, a guy named Darren, assured us the area was safe, though he laughed a little too hard when someone joked about the beast of Bladenboro. "Old wives' tales," Darren said, waving it off. "It's just a bobcat or something, nothing to worry about." I'd heard about the beast in campfire stories years ago. A hulking predator, some said, that prowled these parts. Back then, I'd written it off as a tale to keep kids from wandering into the woods. Now, standing on the edge of those woods, it felt a little less ridiculous. The first day passed uneventfully. We explored the nearby trails, marveling at the towering oaks and thick underbrush. The wind picked up as evening fell, rustling the leaves like whispers just out of earshot. That night, we built a fire in the clearing behind the house. The group of us, 8 in total, shared drinks and swapped stories. Darren regaled us with tales of his adventurous past, though most of us could tell he was embellishing. The firelight danced off the trees, and for a while it felt almost peaceful. But then the wind shifted. It carried with it a strange, musky scent, something like wet fur and decay. Bruno, the retriever belonging to one of the hikers, started growling low in his throat. His hackles were up, and his eyes were fixed on the tree line. "What's he growling at?" someone asked nervously. "Probably a raccoon," Darren said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. I stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. At first, I saw nothing, just shadows layered on shadows, but then a shape emerged, a tall, broad figure that seemed to melt into the trunk of a tree. It didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. "What the hell is that?" I muttered, my voice barely audible. The others followed my gaze. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the group. Darren grabbed a flashlight and aimed it toward the figure, but the beam only caught flickering branches. The figure was gone. "Let's head inside," Darren said, his casual tone betrayed by the tightness in his jaw. We moved quickly, packing up and retreating to the relative safety of the house. But safety felt like an illusion. As we sat in the dimly lit living room, the sounds outside grew louder. Branches snapped and heavy footfalls crunched the underbrush. "Maybe it's a bear," someone suggested, though the words sounded more like a plea than an explanation. "It's not a bear," I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "Bears don't just sit and watch like that." The noise stopped suddenly, plunging the house into an eerie silence. We waited, breaths held until Darren finally suggested we try to sleep. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard something heavy hit the side of the house. Then again, closer this time. I grabbed the hunting knife I always carried on trips like this and crept toward the window. Pulling back the curtain just a sliver, I saw it, a massive shape moving through the shadows, its outline barely distinguishable from the trees. It was hunched, with long arms that almost touched the ground, and its eyes, glowing faintly, seemed to pierce through the darkness. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The next morning, we debated what to do. Darren insisted it was just wildlife, but the rest of us weren't so sure. When we ventured outside, we found claw marks gouged into the wooden porch and tufts of dark fur snagged on the splintered railing. That night, the creature came closer. It didn't just watch from the trees, it circled the house, its heavy footsteps echoing through the walls. At one point, Bruno barked furiously at the back door, only to yelp and retreat when something slammed against it, hard enough to crack the wood. We couldn't stay. We packed our things quietly, each movement deliberate and controlled. Darren argued we should wait until morning, but the rest of us overruled him. Slipping out into the night, we moved silently through the trees, staying close together. The wind had picked up again, masking the sound of our footsteps, but carrying the creature's low growls closer. At one point, it charged. The group scattered in panic as the creature tore through the underbrush, its guttural roar shaking me to my core. I tripped over a root, my knife slipping from my grasp. Scrambling to my feet, I barely had time to dodge as the creature's massive form barreled past me, slamming into a tree with a force that made my teeth rattle. We regrouped farther down the trail, bruised and bloodied, but alive. The creature's roars grew fainter as we neared the edge of the woods. When we finally stumbled into the small town nearby, the locals didn't seem surprised by our story. "The beast of Bladenboro," one old man said with a grim nod. "You're lucky it let you go." Lucky wasn't the word I'd use. Wisconsin in spring has a peculiar charm, with its rolling hills waking up from winter's slumber and a blanket of green spreading through the woods. That's what drew Sylvester Norris to the area, a hiking enthusiast and a trucker who rarely got time to indulge in his hobby. He had joined a group hike organized by a local outdoors club, eager to explore the forests that were rumored to be the most beautiful this time of year. The day had started cloudy, the kind of overcast sky that hung low, making everything feel heavier. The air was damp but not unpleasant, and the group of 7, led by an upbeat guide named Owen, set off down the trail just after breakfast. They planned to complete the loop by nightfall and head back to their cars, parked at the edge of the forest. Sylvester had heard whispers about strange sightings in these woods, stories passed around truck stops on late-night runs, creatures as big as a man, but not quite human. He dismissed them, chalking them up to sleep-deprived imaginations or practical jokes. Yet something about those stories lingered in the back of his mind as they entered the dense thickets. The trail wove through groves of birch and oak, the occasional open glade dotted with wildflowers. As they walked, Sylvester fell into conversation with a woman named Mara, a history teacher with a knack for trivia. She shared tidbits about the region, sliced from its early logging history to the Native American legends that gave the area its eerie reputation. By midday, they stopped for lunch at a rocky overlook. The clouds had thickened, and a chilly breeze rustled through the trees. Sylvester couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just him. Others in the group seemed uneasy, glancing over their shoulders more than usual. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" Mara asked, breaking the tension. She was right. The usual forest symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves had gone silent. Owen shrugged it off, saying it was probably a predator in the area, a wolf or a bear. "They don't bother people," he said, his smile a little too forced. The first sign that something wasn't right came about an hour later. They had just crossed a small stream when Owen stopped abruptly. Ahead, in the soft mud, were footprints. Massive ones, far larger than any human foot. "Bear tracks?" Someone ventured hesitantly. Owen frowned. "No. Bears don't walk like this. These are upright." The group exchanged uneasy glances but continued on, their chatter subdued. Sylvester's pulse quickened, his mind drifting back to those truck stop tales. He tried to rationalize it, maybe a prank or someone messing around, but the unease in his gut refused to settle. As they moved deeper into the woods, Sylvester caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye. He stopped, squinting into the dense trees. For a moment he thought he saw a figure, a tall, broad silhouette that seemed to blend into the shadows. When he blinked, it was gone. "Everything okay?" Mara asked, noticing his hesitation. "Yeah," he lied, shaking his head. The first encounter happened as the sun dipped low, casting the woods in an eerie half-light. They were setting up a small fire in a clearing when Mara screamed. Sylvester spun around and saw it. Something crouched behind a tree, its hulking form partially obscured. It wasn't moving, but its eyes glinted in the dim light, fixed on them with an intensity that made Sylvester's skin crawl. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered. Owen shone a flashlight toward the tree, but the figure vanished before the beam could land. The group erupted into frantic discussion, but Owen, trying to maintain control, insisted they stay calm. As the night wore on, the creature didn't attack outright. Instead, it circled the camp, its presence palpable, even when it wasn't visible. The fire cast long, flickering shadows, and every so often, Sylvester would catch a glimpse of those glowing eyes watching from the darkness. The group decided to abandon their camp at first light. But the night stretched endlessly, filled with snapping branches and low, guttural sounds that seemed to come from all sides. Sylvester gripped his hiking knife tightly, his knuckles white. When dawn finally broke, they moved quickly, packing their gear in silence. The creature was still there, its stalking more brazen in the early light. At one point, it darted between trees just a few yards away, its massive frame sending shockwaves of fear through the group. Mara stumbled, twisting her ankle, and Sylvester helped her up, keeping his eyes on the surrounding woods. The group pressed on, sticking close together. They reached the parking area just as the sky darkened with an incoming storm. Sylvester glanced back once, catching a final glimpse of the creature standing at the edge of the trees. It was taller than he'd imagined, its matted fur glistening in the rain. Later, as they drove away, Owen mentioned the local legends of the Wisconsin Wildman, a Bigfoot-like creature said to roam the state's forests. Sylvester didn't say anything, but he couldn't help but wonder if the stories were more than just legends. The experience haunted him long after the trip. The woods had always been a place of peace for him, but now every shadow seemed to hold something waiting, watching.